We know radioactive isotopes are deadly, as overexposure can cause the human body to shut down. Most acute radiation sickness related deaths have come from the two bombs dropped in Japan at the end of the Second World War, accidents in industrial settings, or from orphan sources. However, a much less likely setting for radiation sickness is in the attempt of assassination, and this would be the case in London in 2006. Being a Londoner, the poisoning of Alexander Litvinenko has always stayed with me. Maybe it was the wall-to-wall newspaper coverage or the haunting final pictures of the victim. The incident has always created interest in the British public. But this video will not go too much into the geopolitical reasons for this. Instead, we'll focus on the more radioactive aspects of this story. Today we're looking at the world's first recorded death linked to polonium-210 induced acute radiation syndrome. The type of radioisotope used caused interest in the post-incident investigation, and traces of polonium would be found throughout London as well as on the continent. The use of polonium-210 would create a link back to the Russian Federation, one of the few countries still producing it commercially. But before we get into the event and the murder weapon, let's look at some background on the victim, Mr. Litvinenko. Much of the timeline is from the inquest into Litvinenko's death by the British government and goes into much greater detail than I will here, so this is a brief history of the victim's background. Alexander Litvinenko was born on the 4th of December 1962 in the city of Voronezh, Russia. In 1980, after finishing school, Litvinenko enlisted in a military college, graduating in 1985 as a lieutenant. Between 1985 and 1988, he served in the Dzerzhinsky Division of Forces of the Interior Ministry, relating to the protection of gold bullion trains. After 3 years of service, Litvinenko was recruited to join the KGB, and after a few years of training, was posted to the Moscow offices of the Committee for State Security in 1991. Needless to say, early 90s Russia was a turbulent time of attempted assassinations and the dismantling of the USSR. As a result, Litvinenko served under a number of different intelligence organisations, eventually forming into the FSB. He worked in the anti-terrorism department. During the early 90s, Litvinenko developed a friendship with Mr. Berezovsky, who would later move to the UK in 2000 in exile. In the summer of 1997, Mr. Litvinenko was transferred within the FSB to the Department for the Investigation and Prevention of Organised Crime. During his time working there on Litvinenko's own admission, undertook tasks that he deemed to be unlawful. This would eventually culminate in a press conference on the 17th of November 1998, in which Mr. Litvinenko and others publicly denounced the FSB in front of the world's media. Mr. Litvinenko and all the officers involved in the press conference were kicked out of the FSB. In October 2000, Litvinenko fled the country to the UK, and upon reaching Heathrow Airport on the 1st of November, he approached a policeman and said, "I am a KGB officer and I'm asking for political asylum." Asylum was granted by the British government in May 2001, and Litvinenko became a vocal opponent to the Russian government, publishing numerous allegations of conducting or sponsoring domestic and foreign terrorism. Litvinenko and Berezovsky, who had by this time also sought exile in 2000 after falling out with new President Putin, carried on their friendship in London, both speaking out against the Russian government. Litvinenko had settled in a house owned by one of Berezovsky's companies in Muswell Hill, London. Now that is a brief outline of how Litvinenko ended up in London. However, it wouldn't be until 2006 that he would drink tea allegedly spiked with polonium-210. During the night of the 1st of November 2006, the otherwise fit and healthy Litvinenko unexpectedly fell ill. During the day, which was the anniversary of the Litvinenko's family's exile from Russia, Mr. Litvinenko had been to meetings in central London. He had been ill a few weeks earlier, but this bout of sickness had cleared itself up. In the evening, Mrs. Litvinenko had cooked her husband a meal to celebrate their exile anniversary, and Alexandra had shown a healthy appetite. The couple settled in for an early night. However, this would change late evening of the first and in the early hours of the second. In the middle of the night, Litvinenko started vomiting uncontrollably. After moving to a spare room, he did not get any reprieve throughout the night, and by morning he was exhausted. Throughout the day, Litvinenko struggled to keep any food or drink down, and his condition worsened. A private doctor was called for and suggested he take salt and mineral solutions. However, he could not keep them down as well. In the early hours of the 3rd, an ambulance was called for, but the paramedics, not recognising the early signs of radiation sickness, thought he had the flu and suggested he stayed indoors. During the day of the 3rd, his condition worsened further still as he reported experiencing bloody diarrhoea. Again, the private doctor was called for, and it was suggested that this time Litvinenko might be suffering from food poisoning or an infection, but regardless, must be admitted to hospital. Again, an ambulance was called for on the 3rd at 4 p.m, and he was transported to Barnet Hospital. Gastroenteritis with mild dehydration was initially diagnosed, and Litvinenko underwent a wide range of tests to try and identify the cause of his symptoms. Initial blood test samples showed high levels of white blood cells, but platelet counts to be normal. However, test results in the following days showed Litvinenko's platelet count to fall to abnormal levels, as well as his red and white blood cell counts. The worrying rapid decline of Alexander's condition alarmed the medical personnel treating him. After the 14th, a new consultant took over the case and saw a similarity of the symptoms of Litvinenko to someone suffering from leukemia who had also received a whole body dose of radiation before a bone marrow transplant. On the 15th, a Geiger counter was used to try and test for radiation poisoning, but no detection of radiation was found. At this point, thallium poisoning was suspected and treatment towards this was made. The treating consultant was alarmed by the rate that Litvinenko's bone marrow had degenerated and suggested a transplant. In order to facilitate this, Litvinenko was transferred to UCLH on the 17th of November. Prussian blue was prescribed for the suspected thallium poisoning, and initially seemed to be working well. This would not be the case for too long as Litvinenko continued to vomit blood and further deteriorate. On the 19th of November, a bed became available for Mr. Litvinenko on the ICU, where he was transferred to on the evening of the same day. On the 20th, the theory of thallium poisoning began to fall apart, with bone marrow failure, muscular gut damage and low traces of thallium puzzling doctors. On the 21st of November, consultant Dr. Nafwani took advice from Dr. Dargan, who suggested contacting the Atomic Weapons Establishment to test urine samples from Litvinenko. That night, he suffered 2 cardiac arrests but was successfully resuscitated. At the same time the samples at the AWE were tested, traces of polonium were found, but were discounted as being contamination from the plastic storage bottle. Further urine analysis using gamma-ray spectroscopy showed a characteristic 803 keV photon emission, raising the possibility of polonium-210 poisoning. However, at 8:51 on Thursday the 23rd of November, Litvinenko suffered his 3rd and final cardiac arrest, resulting in death. The official reason for death was multiple organ failure, including progressive heart failure. The post-mortem of Litvinenko's body raised unique issues, due to the raised levels of radiation. Measurements of polonium-210 were found using tissue samples from Litvinenko's lung, spleen, kidneys and liver. The highest result of 49,000 becquerels per gram of tissue was found in the kidney sample, and the lowest 3,500 becquerels per gram of tissue in the lung samples. It was estimated that the intake was around 4.4 gigabecquerels of polonium-210. Polonium-210 poisoning is very hard to detect, even though it is deadly, with 1 microgram being more than enough to kill an average adult. It is only lethal if ingested. This is because it is an ionizing alpha radiation emitter. Alpha particles don't have the ability to penetrate far into objects, leaving polonium-210 relatively safe to handle. But being an emitter of alpha radiation makes it deadly if ingested into the human body, as it is perfect for penetrating soft tissue and especially the bloodstream, killing you from within. The radioisotope has a half-life of around 138 days. And this explains how a Geiger counter could not detect the presence of the radioisotope on Litvinenko. With a dead ex-FSB officer and suspected polonium poisoning, investigators were left with a question: how and why? Not surprisingly, the event had raised the awareness of the Metropolitan Police Counter-Terrorism Department. The investigators retraced Litvinenko's steps on the 1st of November, the first day he had reported being ill. He had gone into central London from his house in Muswell Hill to meet up with different associates. One such meeting was in an Itsu in Piccadilly with Mario Scaramella, an officer and Italian nuclear expert. Litvinenko had later on in the day gone to the Pine Bar at the Millennium Hotel in Mayfair, where he had tea with Andrei Lugovoy and Dmitry Kovtun. I put on my mask and gone down to the outside of the hotel, now called the Biltmore Mayfair, so you don't have to. The two that Alexander was meeting were already at the bar when he arrived, and a pot of tea had already been served to the table, and Litvinenko drank a cup. During the investigation, radiation tests were conducted for everywhere that Litvinenko had been on the 1st. Forensic evidence from the bar showed high levels of polonium-210 contamination, and the epicenter was found to be at the table where the meeting had taken place. Further supporting the tea hypothesis, one of the pots at the bar showed considerable contamination. Investigators found 3 distinct traces of polonium in and out of London, hinting at 3 attempts on Litvinenko's life, with one leading to a small exposure of plutonium-210 before the 1st of November. The first attempt was thought to have happened on the 16th of October in security firm Erinis, where Andrei Lugovoy and Dmitry Kovtun had a meeting with Alexander. One of the meeting rooms had traces of polonium-210, and also the nearby Best Western in which the two men had prepared for the meeting, which was also the same room that Mr. Lugovoy had slept in that night. High alpha counts were found in the bathroom sink, where it is believed the poison was disposed of. The night of the 16th, Litvinenko had experienced vomiting and an unexplained bout of sickness. The second trace was found to have started on the 25th of October on a plane from Moscow to London on British Airways Flight 875. The alleged assassin Lugovoy arrived shortly after midnight at the Sheraton Park Lane. Between the 26th and 28th of October, Lugovoy and Litvinenko met a couple of times, and although there are traces in his room, no attempt was thought to have been made to administer the polonium. Again, traces of alpha contamination were found in the bathroom, and 2 months after the event, detectives located towels with traces of polonium-210 that Lugovoy had chucked away. The towel, as quoted from The Guardian, has been named the most radioactive towel in history, although this does seem a little hyperbolic. The third and final attempt was the lethal dose on the 1st of November. As well as the hotels and meeting places, traces were found in passenger flights BA875 and BA873 from Moscow to Heathrow on the 21st and 31st of October, as well as BA flights 872 and 874 from Heathrow to Moscow on the 28th of October and the 3rd of November. It was estimated that around 33,000 people were potentially exposed to the deadly alpha emitter from the contaminated planes. During the whole investigation, only 3 people were found to have polonium traces: Lugovoy, Kovtun and Litvinenko. After tracking his Oyster card and subsequent examination of the bus he had used, found no trace of the radioisotope. The alleged assassins claimed innocence, and extradition attempts from the UK to return the suspects from Russia was denied. Lugovoy claimed that it was Litvinenko that had contaminated him in a bungled MI6 plot. The Met Police had a number of other suspects, and the true motives behind what happened may never be known. The Sir Robert Owen inquiry goes into a lot more detail about the incident, with a full timeline pieced together from the investigation. The event highlights the danger of alpha radiation and its effects on the human body. A radioisotope like polonium-210 is very hard to identify if ingested, and it is lucky that there were no other reported deaths from accidental ingestion from any of the contaminated areas. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you'd like to support the channel financially, you can on Patreon from $1 per creation, and that gets you early access to videos and access to votes. I have YouTube membership as well from 99p per month, and that also gets you early access to videos. Check me out on Twitter, and also if you'd like to wear my merch, you can purchase it at my Teespring store. And all that's left to say is thank you for watching.